brain development is not really over till you're 25. Your brain is still pretty plastic and it is still being molded right through your undergraduate career. And so the shortcuts that ChatGPT offers are a disaster for your neural development. You will just be dumber.
Conlon. Without further ado, I give you Sir Niall Ferguson, who has always put the truth first. Welcome to the Austin Union.
Well, thank you very much for that lovely introduction. It's a pleasure to be here. It's the first time I've been in this building, and I wasn't expecting to be here this evening. But as has already been mentioned, the possibility of riots in downtown Austin, I presume in relation to the Trump administration's immigration and deportation policies, has led us to retreat or withdraw to a safer location. And I'm just delighted to be with the Austin Union wherever we choose to meet, because I've felt from the very earliest days of the foundation of this university that it should have an independent debating society, just as Oxford has had for so many years, because it's a very important feature of being an undergraduate that you should learn about associational life and about politics. And really the only way to do that is to have something like the Austin Union. What I'm going to say this evening, I'll be debating with myself rather than with an invisible second person. We'll have a conversation after my remarks, is personal. It's not the view of the trustees or the view of the university. It's my own thinking about the future of the university in general, but our university in particular. And I want to begin with some science fiction, because there's no better way of thinking about the future than to read the work of one of the great writers of science fiction, namely Neil Stephenson. In The Diamond Age, which was published in 1995, there's a wonderful piece of dialogue near the beginning. I'm going to quote, "I'm an engineer, just promoted to bespoke recently. Did some work on this project, as it happens." "Oh, what sort of work?" "Oh, PI stuff, mostly," Hackworth said. Supposedly Finkel-McGraw still kept up with things and would recognize the abbreviation for pseudo-intelligence and perhaps even appreciate that Hackworth had made this assumption. Finkel-McGraw brightened a bit. "You know, when I was a lad, they called it AI, artificial intelligence." Hackworth allowed himself a tight, narrow and brief smile. "Well, something to be said for cheekiness, I suppose." The Diamond Age is one of Stevenson's best books, and if I achieve nothing else this evening, I hope it will be to persuade you to read it, and indeed to read all of Stevenson's works. As I'll try to show, he's been an extraordinary prophet of our time. Phrases like the metaverse originate in Stevenson's work. It's in Snow Crash. And I'm going to come back to Stevenson at the end. But for now, let's focus on pseudo-intelligence, which I think is a much better term than artificial intelligence. The Diamond Age is set in a dystopian future where nanotechnology as well as AI are well established. You're surrounded in this world by tiny nano objects. There's been a revolution in material sciences so that there are computer compilers that can synthesize basic food and other necessities in the home through a kind of 3D printer. So technologically, it's ahead of us, even today, not 30 years after he wrote the book. But socially, Stevenson's world has gone backwards. Everybody is organized, or nearly everybody, into files, which are like tribes. And the dominant file, which runs the world, are the neo-Victorians, who've adopted Victorian social and sartorial habits. And their part of the system is New Atlantis. There are three other files: the Han, you can guess who they are, the Nipponese, and Hindustan. Everybody lives under a common economic protocol, which would be Peter Thiel's nightmare of world government. It's a kind of global system of IP enforcement, where intellectual property rights are enforced with draconian criminal justice. And there's an underclass. And this underclass, a little bit like in Snow Crash, lives in unbelievably squalid conditions. The central character is a little girl called Nell. Stevenson's quite good, I think, at women characters. And Nell is a bright little girl from the underclass who's grown up in the slums around Shanghai. And she's given a stolen copy of an interactive AI book called The Young Lady's Illustrated Primer. This book was commissioned by one of the wealthy neo-Victorian equity lords, Alexander Chung-Sik Finkel-McGraw, who appeared in that little passage I quoted from earlier. It was intended for his granddaughter, but for reasons I won't go into, it falls through theft into the hands of Nell. And the story is Nell's interaction with this immersive, interactive, and adaptive book, which is really everything that Sam Altman wants you to believe AI can be. So why am I telling you all this? I'm telling you all this because I want to prepare you for the future shock that lies ahead of you. To give you a sense of how big that could be, I want to go back to the time when I was coming to the end of my freshman year at Oxford. So to 1983. Ronald Reagan was president. Margaret Thatcher won re-election to a second term that year. It was one of the peaks, perhaps the last real peak of Cold War superpower tension. That was the year the Korean Airlines flight 007 was shot down by the Soviet Air Force, killing all 269 people on board, including a US congressman. Soviet officer Stanislav Petrov averted World War III by correctly recognizing that what appeared to be an incoming US missile attack was just a false alarm. It was also the year of Able Archer 83, a NATO exercise that the Russians thought was a US first strike. Here's another surprising feature of the world in 1983. The People's Daily reported that China would run out of food and clothes by the year 2000 if the Communist Party's population control efforts were unsuccessful. So you have to imagine a world where China's dirt poor. In 1983, that was the year that ARPANET migrated to TCP/IP. Most people think that's really the beginning of the internet. It was the year the first mobile cellular telephone call was made in Chicago. It was the year that subscribers to PC Magazine received a disc with multi-tool Word on it. It was later to be shortened to Word, the first Microsoft word processing program. At Oxford, the only times I ever used a computer were when I was typesetting a student magazine that I edited. There were no mobile phones. We used coin-operated call boxes when we wanted to call our parents, which was rarely. We wrote letters or notes to one another, which were delivered to our pigeonholes in the college porter's lodge. I had never, and still have never, played a video game. I looked down on people who did. All I really did was to read books. So this world I'm describing to you must seem more alien than the world my parents told me about, which was Glasgow University in the 1950s, because the degree of change between the 50s and the 80s and between the 80s and now is just much less. We really had no idea in 1983 how radically the world was going to change. We assumed we would do one of five things: law, media, i.e. the BBC, government, i.e. the Foreign Office or MI6, academia, which was the route I took, or banking. That was it. No other careers were discussed. Nobody talked about starting a business. Now, you might think that we were therefore very poorly prepared for the world that was barreling towards us from Silicon Valley. But we were actually well prepared. And that's because Oxford taught us 7 highly fungible skills. 1, the ability to read a lot. A typical reading list would be 5 whole books and 5 journal articles, which you had to read in a week. We learned to think. I don't remember ever being told how to think, but I worked out that I did it better if I went for a long walk after reading the books. We were taught to write. You had 1 or 2 essays that you had to handwrite. And then we were taught to debate. You had to go and read them aloud in a tutorial and then have questions fired at you by your tutor. And there was nowhere to hide because it was only you. The small group teaching is still one of the peculiarities of the Oxford system. We were taught to function under stress, and nothing quite matches the stress of Oxford finals when you sit or sat 10 3-hour exams in the space of 7 days, under timed conditions, wearing a white tie, a gown, and carrying a mortarboard. We were taught to differentiate between bullshit and bona fide content. We were taught to cohabit and cooperate with our contemporaries on a tight budget. It turned out that these were pretty good survival skills for the age of the internet. The problem is that your future shock is going to be bigger than mine was. Sam Altman gives good interviews. One should always read them. He says we're on the brink of a new renaissance. I'm not sure that's the right analogy, but that's the one he's going with. In the Financial Times, which recently profiled him, he talks about genius-level intelligence being used by 10% of the world. That's their estimate for ChatGPT usage. Quote, "Do you think you're smarter than O3 right now? I don't. And I feel completely unbothered, and I bet you do too. I'm hugging my baby, enjoying my tea. I'm going to go do very exciting work all afternoon. I'll be using O3 to do better work than I was able to do a month ago. He also has said in a different interview, it's a simplification, but older people use ChatGPT like Google. People in their 20s and 30s use it as a life advisor. College students use it like an operating system. This is still Altman. They set it up in complex ways, connected to files, and have detailed prompts memorized or saved to paste in and out. Only 20% of us baby boomers use AI weekly. 70% of your generation use it. And the adoption of AI is really picking up now. There's a new paper out by Hartley and co-authors which finds that large language model usage at work in the US has jumped from 30 to 40% in the past year. ChatGPT and Gemini are still the most widely used tools. More and more firms are subscribing to large language models. McKinsey has its own chatbot named Lily. BCG has Dexter. There's a company called Rogo, which is the investment banking analyst bot. This is happening very fast. Training compute is doubling every 5.5 months. When ChatGPT launched, which is less than 3 years ago, it was using 3% of the compute that today's state-of-the-art models use. In another 2.5 years' time, the models will be using 30 times more compute than today and 1,000 times more than ChatGPT when it was launched. The other thing that's really increasing is the sheer cost of this. There's a great post by Toby Ord, who's a very thoughtful commentator, that makes the point that inference scaling is less impressive than you think because of the x-axis problem in OpenAI charts, where they use a logarithmic x-axis. If you're doing your x-axis with a log scale, it's because things are taking way longer than you'd hoped, and you don't want the investors to spot that. He calls this the characteristic signature of brute force. All that I'm describing to you has two consequences. The first is that we are in the midst of the biggest capital expenditure boom since the railroads, since the 19th century railroads. Quite distinct from the phase when software ate the world, when CapEx was really historically low. If you look at the numbers for what the big semiconductor companies and the big AI hyperscalers are spending, if you include R&D, we're looking at trillions of dollars, 576 billion last year and 646 forecast this year. Something like 11% of nominal GDP on an annual basis. This is something unfamiliar to us. You need to go back to the 19th century to see CapEx on this scale. The second consequence is that labor is being shed rapidly in those sectors where adoption is highest. And the most telling thing for me is that the hyperscalers, Google, Microsoft, Apple, Tesla, Meta, NVIDIA, Palantir, they've all stopped hiring. Headcount has just stopped growing, which is why computer science majors out of Stanford can't get jobs. So this is an amazing time of economic change that you're heading towards, and indeed you're part of it. And all of this is going on in the context of Cold War II. If you are a Mary Meeker fan, as I am, you may have looked at the latest mega deck produced by Bond, which is her base these days. Quote, the global race to build and deploy frontier AI systems is increasingly defined by the strategic rivalry between the United States and China. That is correct. I have been saying this for some years. The arms race in this Cold War is on a broader front than in the first Cold War, which is heavily focused on nuclear weapons and space. This Cold War is a technological race in the realm of AI and of quantum computing and many other fields too. Here's a quote from Microsoft President Brad Smith. Given the nature of technology markets and their potential network effect, this race between the US and China for international influence likely will be won by the fastest first mover. Hence the frantic casting aside of any regulatory breaks in both superpowers. So my favorite facts about technology and its application is as follows. And I came upon this writing the preface for a book on AI called Genesis, co-authored by Eric Schmidt and Henry Kissinger. So question, which did humans build more of in the past 80 years? Nuclear warheads or nuclear power stations? Well, today there are about 12,500 nuclear warheads in the world, a number rapidly rising as China builds its nuclear arsenal. There are 436 nuclear reactors in operation for civilian power generation. In absolute terms, nuclear electricity generation peaked in 2006. And so that's a clue. When nuclear fission was discovered, as a species we had a choice: use it for production or use it for destruction. We've overwhelmingly invested in destruction. That may be changing as we realize that we desperately need nuclear power, but after a very long period of stagnation. All right. What about the educational consequences of all of this? What is happening to education in the age of AI? Well, let's begin by asking, what do students do all day? Ask yourself, what do you do? The Bureau of Labor Statistics found that the average full-time college student spent only 2.76 hours a day on all education-related activities for a total of 19.3 hours a week. In a book called Academically Adrift, Richard Aram and Josipa Roxa reported that students in their sample spent 12 to 14 hours a week studying. That was 50% less than a few decades before. There's a bunch of survey data like this that points to how very little studying students actually do. And this is remarkable because it's against the law for all those institutions that take federal funding. A typical 3-credit course should entail a minimum of 9 hours of student work a week. Assuming a 12-credit course load, students should be spending at least 36 hours attending class or doing homework. So what are students doing? What are you doing? Perhaps you're not representative, but what are your contemporaries up to? It's not that they're working part-time jobs to pay their way through, which would be one romantic explanation. No. Actually, just 40% of full-time undergraduates are employed, compared with twice that proportion back in the mid-1990s. So, what's going on? According to one survey, the average first-year student in the US reported spending 5.3 hours a week participating in co-curricular activities, 2.4 hours working on campus, 6.9 hours working off campus, and 11.9 hours relaxing and socializing. This omits an extraordinarily important change that has happened in the past 2.5 years. Remember that ChatGPT was released just in November of 2022, a year after we launched UATX. I think this is crucial if we're trying to understand what it is that students now do. As recently as soon after the launch of ChatGPT as January 2023, a survey found that 90% of students had already used ChatGPT to help with assignments. Altman is quite down with this. Writing a paper the old-fashioned way is not going to be a thing, he said. That's for sure. Here are a few quotations from an article in New York Magazine on the subject. College is just how well I can use ChatGPT at this point. That was a student in Utah. With ChatGPT, I can write an essay in 2 hours that normally takes 12. A freshman at Wilfrid Laurier in Ontario. An essay with ChatGPT, it's like it just gives you straight up what you have to follow. You just don't really have to think that much. A freshman finance major at either Columbia or NYU, the magazine was too shy to reveal which. Okay, no need for a show of hands, no point. You all using it. It goes without saying. And none of the standard procedures that universities think they have can stop this or regulate it in any way. In June 2024, some researchers used fake student profiles to put 100% AI-generated work into professors' grading piles at a British university. And the professors missed 97% of those fake essays. Things like Turnitin, they just don't work. The author of the New York Magazine piece fed an AI-generated or largely AI-generated paper into Zero GPT, and it came back as just 11.7% AI generated when it was much, much more. But the best bit was I then fed a chunk of text from the book of Genesis into Zero GPT, and it came back as 93.33% AI generated. I guess if you think AI is godlike, but... And of course, there are now platforms for professors which allow you to produce AI-generated feedback on student essays. So pretty soon, it'll be LLM-generated essays being graded by LLMs. My son loves showing me the video of the two chatbots that switch from English into R2-D2 speak. That's the future. There's a nice essay by Graham Burnett in The New Yorker, which I would have given the headline, How I Learned to Stop Worrying and Love AI. Here's a quote from it. On campus, we're in a bizarre interlude. Everyone seems intent and pretending that the most significant revolution in the world of thought in the past century isn't happening. The approach appears to be, we'll just tell the kids they can't use these tools and carry on as before. This is simply madness, and it won't hold for long. And yet, this is clearly very bad. Very bad for students. Worse than Jonathan Haidt's worst nightmares about mobile social media apps, which he told me the other day when I met him, are even worse than he thought when he wrote his book. there have been some studies done looking at the effects of AI usage on young people, and you won't be surprised to find that or to hear that it correlates with, quote, a deterioration in critical thinking skills. And this is more pronounced in younger participants. There was a study published in February by Microsoft and Carnegie Mellon showing that a person's confidence in generative AI correlates with reduced critical thinking effort. Robert Sternberg's a psychology professor at Cornell. He says, the greatest worry in these times of generative AI is not that it may compromise human creativity or intelligence, but that it already has. We are in a unique position. We can adapt. We could be much nimbler in ways that established universities clearly can't. The degree of demoralization at the established universities on this issue is stunning on both sides of the Atlantic. People have gone through all the stages of grieving already and have just essentially reached acceptance that all students will cheat and all work will be AI generated. We don't need to go there. I would propose 5 steps. I believe we need to create quarantine space in which traditional methods of learning can be maintained and all devices excluded. I propose we call it the cloister. We should assume that all study outside the cloister will be done with the use of AI. Inside the cloister, we should allocate time to A, reading printed books, B, discussing texts and problem sets, C, writing essays and problem sets with a pen and paper, D, we should do assessment via oral and written examinations under strict invigilated conditions. And time in the cloister should be defined and monitored, and it should be around 7 hours a day. So we flip the normal allocation of time and expect students to spend way more time in the cloister, the classroom, the library, the cloister, than outside. Vacations, of course, will be outside the cloister too. And I think we will need to adapt our admissions procedures to take account of these powerful forces so that we are going to have to target and recruit students capable of living in the cloister. And this brings me back to Neil Stephenson and my concluding reflections. Stevenson wrote a wonderful book, Anathem, which was published in 2008. And it imagines a future, a very far distant future, long after a nuclear war. And in the wake of this nuclear war, for which the scientists are blamed by the survivors, scientists are required to enter what are called consents, in other words, monasteries, secular or scientific monasteries, to protect their activities from their potential social consequences. And those in the monasteries are called the avowed. They're separate from secular society. And they're banned from possessing or operating the most advanced technologies under very stiff penalties. The avowed follow a life path, the discipline, which Stevenson whimsically calls the Cartesian discipline, after Saint Cartas, obviously Descartes. the founder of the mathic world. He uses the word mathic. It's a brilliant, brilliant book, which imagines the revival of monasticism in the context of a post-apocalyptic crisis of confidence in science itself. Stevenson here, I think, is prophetic, just as he is in the Diamond Age. When we came up with the idea of UATX, the threats that we saw were threats from cancel culture, from a politicization of the academy, a kind of massive political skew to the left that had led to an all-out war on academic freedom, as well as on the idea of meritocracy. And I still think that those threats exist, and they will not disappear under the presidency of Donald Trump. Indeed, I fear that the onslaught on Harvard that we currently see will probably cause the so-called progressive elements to dig in and aim to survive and then revive after 2028. But in addition to those threats from the Great Awakening, there are new threats that we now need to focus our minds on. This new challenge posed by AI is in many ways a more profound one to learning itself, to the act of learning. I'm relieved that we exist because I don't see the established institutions rising to this challenge at all. But I think we can model the correct adaptive response, and I think that it needs to be along these lines. That is not to repudiate, reject, and cut ourselves off from the new technology. We need to learn to use it. But if we're to know how to learn, then we also need to be able to cut ourselves off from it for a part of each day throughout our academic careers. And that, it seems to me, will be one of the defining characteristics of the university of the future, that it will resemble the cloisters that I first encountered at Oxford, legacies of an entirely different and indeed in some measure pre-scientific era of scholarship. Thank you all very much indeed. And now Dylan is going to join me here, and we're going to have a conversation. And the people with finals are going to scarper. Back to the cloister with you. Dylan.
Professor Ferguson, there's certainly a lot to think about. I want to pull back from AI for just one moment and take a look at where we're seated right now. We originally planned to do this in the beautiful UATX atrium, and now we're in my good friend Hayden's living room. So it's kind of a scene change. But it seems like something that UATX and the union have in common is that they both seek to be easily adaptable to whatever new circumstances may provide. Particularly in regards to the union, we take our namesake after the Oxford Union, which has certainly made its impact on humanity and is an organization that's been around for a very, very long time. But it seems like the world is changing to such an extent that new rules, new adaptations must be found in order for an institution like the union to survive and to thrive. Do you have any thoughts on exactly what lessons we might take from the Oxford Union and apply them to the UATX union, or with things that we should shy away from or adapt to?
Well, I was shocked by something that happened late last year at the Oxford Union when a disastrous debate occurred on the question of Israel, the Palestinians post-October 7th. And what was disastrous about that debate were really two things. One, disruption and heckling directed entirely at the pro-Israel speakers. I mean, disruption and heckling are part and parcel of debating, but this was particularly obnoxious. But the really bad thing was that the president of the union, who was presiding over the debate, was very clearly on the other side of the debate, and acted in ways that I thought did great damage to the reputation of the union. So in a way, it's a good thing that the Austin Union exists, because it may be that the Oxford Union is in some kind of spiral of self-destruction. It's crucial that the contentious issues of the day should be debated at such institutions. But for that to happen, for it to work, the institution itself can't take sides. And the elected officers of the union have to be committed to fairness in debate. And I saw that tradition really badly undermined at Oxford. So that would be a key piece of advice. Don't shy away from the controversial subjects, but make sure that the institution doesn't take sides, no matter what the president's personal inclinations and beliefs might be.
So the kind of death spiral that Oxford is in seems to be a result of perhaps both an external change in the way that culture is presented or that culture permeates through each individual, and then an internal case of the Oxford Union electing the wrong kinds of people, not verifying or having a robust enough structure in order to prevent people who would be likely to take sides. But how do you actually build those internal structures to prevent, bad actors from getting in? That seems to be the fundamental problem of government, fundamental problem of any organization, really.
But it's almost inevitable that bad actors, to use your term, will become presidents of any body in which there are elections, because politics attracts a special skill set, and it selects for mendacity. Truth-telling people do badly in politics. That's why I could never get elected to anything, even at Oxford, and have given up on the idea of elected office, gave up long ago, because my passion is truth-telling. That's actually a major problem in politics, where from very early on you learn the need not to say what you think. So we have to design constitutions both for governments and for societies as well as for universities that assume that bad actors will get into positions of power sometimes. And I think that's the great challenge of a free society, creating systems of rules that are, to use a phrase from a century ago, knave-proof. I mean, I think the US Constitution is the shining example of a constitution that was designed by the founders with the assumption that a would-be tyrant would become president at some point. Hamilton in particular, but also Madison, had studied the history of republics. They knew that republics tend not to last very long. It's amazing that a republic should be approaching its 250th birthday. That's really, really unusual. And the problem, and some of us have been studying it this term, the problem is that the constitution of a republic is susceptible either to slip from democracy into anarchy, or from monarchy into tyranny. And I think that's what the founders were really preoccupied with. And that's why they took Montesquieu's idea of the separation of powers and they ran with it. And I think so far it served the United States well. When I was drawing up the Constitution for the University of Austin, I took the Constitution of the United States as the model. And if you sit down and compare the two documents, you'll notice that in some cases, very deliberately, I used the same language so that we would have a separation of powers and so that we would have the things that are so central to the functioning of the US Constitution. For me, it was a great insight of this whole 4-year process that most universities didn't have that kind of governance. They didn't have the judicial branch. So I hope that our Constitution will prove as durable as the US Constitution. One thing that's obvious is that no document's perfect. That's why there are amendments. It's also clear that in your first year of running a new operating system, there are bound to be problems and things that you didn't foresee. And I wouldn't deny that there have been quite a number of those problems. The same will apply to the Austin Union. You'll have to tweak the operating system, the Constitution, until you get something that is truly knave-proof. And a final point I'll make, which we discussed before this session, debating societies of this sort are inherently schools for politics. And there will be politics, and I know there has been politics. I think that's a feature, not a bug. I think one should recognize that students are going to learn about politics in two ways. One, by studying politics in class, and the other by doing it. And we should not encourage delusions about the nature of that game. As I work my way through this second volume of Kissinger, I constantly encounter the language of gamesmanship. Richard Nixon, thought of politics as the ultimate game, sort of a combination of poker and football, a game in which only the most ruthless person would prevail. If we kid students into thinking that politics is not like that, then we're not doing them any favors. I got into terrible trouble at Stanford years ago now for suggesting in a private email that students should do Oppo research on their political opponents. It was a sort of joke, really, since Oppo research was in the news at that time. But I remember Alan Dershowitz ringing up and saying, "Don't apologize. You shouldn't apologize. Of course there'll be Oppo research. It's politics." So I think you're in a sense, in a political society, and you will inevitably act as politicians. That's why the Oxford Union has termly presidencies, so that they can have 3 elections a year to maximize the amount of politics they do.
If you could go back, rewrite the UATX Constitution, or perhaps just make some amendments, what are some of those amendments that you might make in light of this whole year, this past year?
The trustees should have a private jet. That would certainly have made my life easier in the last few
As long
years.
as I get access, I'm okay with it. So.
More seriously, I think we need to fix the speed of our process. Our disciplinary process has been too slow. It's the single biggest concern I have. That the independent judicial branch was a great idea, but it hasn't worked fast enough.
On this idea of speed, it kind of intrigues me. Part of the reason that the founding fathers implemented a constitution in such a way that they did is that they were trying to strike this balance between being able to be malleable enough that you could change your laws, you could amend your constitution in light of a different world, but at the same time have something stable, something that people could rely upon. In an institution like UATX, which kind of prides itself on being a startup university, right? It's this kind of dichotomy between an institution that is at once very, very slow, very bureaucratic, administratorial, and one that is supposed to be always flying by the seat of its pants and building the plane while it's in the air, sort of deal. That dichotomy seems to be, I don't know, antithetical to one another. How do you balance that out? Or has UATX kind of found that balance yet? Do you think that there's still more work to be done? How do you go about that?
I think it'll take several years, perhaps the whole 4 years of the first class's time here, to get things right. By which I mean to get the balance right between constitutional governance that works and really does protect academic freedom and preserve individual rights, and the dynamism that is going to enable us to cope with the AI revolution and the other challenges that we face. It would have been astonishing if it had all worked smoothly in the first year. In fact, I would have been deeply suspicious if that had been the case. One of the things that some of you will already be discovering about any startup is how incredibly difficult and demanding a new thing is. I remember a conversation with Elon Musk about this, in which he used one of his favorite phrases about founders having to kind of eat glass. And there is a glass eating element to all of this. I certainly felt I was eating a lot of glass as a trustee in the last 6 months or so, because it really proved much more difficult than I'd foreseen to make things work as we, the founders, had envisioned. But I think one has to derive some satisfaction from the fact that we've got this far. I mean, it's a truly astonishing thing that we're coming to the end of the first academic year and you haven't all given up. There's been remarkably little attrition, very, very little by the standards of established institutions. Morale seems good even in final week. And here we are. There's a debating society that came into existence. There's an artist in residence. There's a culture that formed with, I think, amazing speed. When people ask me about this in the outside world, whether it's at Stanford or at Oxford or in the smouldering ruins of Harvard, I say, look, when we came up with this idea, there was a kind of null hypothesis, which was that we would build it and then the students would turn up and they would immediately replicate all the dreadful features of undergraduate life elsewhere. And then we'd realize, oh, cancel culture is just innate in Gen Z. This is what they do. There's nothing we can do about it. It would happen in any university and it's going to happen to us. But that's not what happened. From very early on, what I perceived, and I saw it in the classroom earlier this term, was a tremendous vitality, a great atmosphere of free-spirited debate, the kind of irreverence that I think is central to undergraduate life. I'm glad to say I haven't been taken too seriously, especially when cast in marble. And so, to my immense relief, whatever else was going wrong institutionally and in the kind of nuts and bolts of the place, the spirit of the students was just great. And that's the most important thing. That's the thing that I've always looked for. In my career, I have looked for, and I'll use a phrase that I remember using when I was trying to explain why I was leaving Oxford. And I remember saying, there's just no champagne in the air here anymore. It's like the air is flat. And I'd noticed in visits to the US universities, including Harvard, that there was champagne in the air. It's 2002, 3, 4. There's no champagne in the air at Harvard anymore. None at Stanford. But there's champagne in the air here, in the metaphorical sense that there's bubbles. There are real bubbles around. That's what I go looking for. That's what I've always been looking for. Young people who are generating enthusiasm, excitement, irreverence. And I find that here, which is, to me, the great achievement. For year one, perhaps the most important thing we could have achieved.
So I want to tackle the beast that is AI or PI, as Stevenson calls it now. Perhaps on this line of thinking of UATX as a startup university and thinking of the kinds of students that it's attracting and the kind of culture that we're cultivating, so to speak, it seems to me that UATX is going to attract or has attracted largely two particular kinds of students. The first is the one that loves the humanities or is deeply interested in the humanities and wants to get that really great liberal arts education that they would find at no other or very few schools in the world. And the other seems to be the kind of person who's in the tech world and they want to build a company, they want to build a product, they want to make a difference. And UATX seems to seek to provide to each one of those kinds of students the faculties of the other that they would otherwise not have access to at any other institution. That being said, you made this point about AI in the classroom, and it seems like the person who's interested in the humanities is going to have much more, it's going to stay much more faithful to reading the books and taking that time to read every page. Whereas the person who is interested in building a company is interested in more of that efficiency, is perhaps going to 80-20 rule it and use AI, more often than not to read Aristotle or to understand Genesis. How do you reconcile these two kinds of students, these two factions? Is it okay that they're different, or do you aim to equalize them? It seems like that's the case with the cloister, of which I need to go buy an outfit for now. So
the outfit in Stevenson's Anathema is really quite a bizarre one. If you've read the book, that they wear a kind of monastic habit, but made out of AI designed super textile that is infinitely adaptive. I haven't got to the point of recommending that UATX students wear monastic robes. That might be a bit too Hogwarts. But I think this division is an old one. I mean, my Cambridge days took me to Christ's College, where C.P. Snow had been when he gave the famous lectures about two cultures. And those two cultures coexisted at Christ's College, and indeed at all the Cambridge colleges. That there at high table would be the people who had won the Nobel Prize and the people who had nearly won the Nobel Prize on the hard sciences side. And then on the other side of the table, the people who'd studied, critical literature with Leavis. I thought the tension and interplay between the two cultures was what made Cambridge a really remarkable place to study. And I think we want to make a virtue of this division and not think that it's a problem. Treat it as a feature, not a bug. There's got to be a kind of interaction between our two factions, our two halves, because I think we genuinely want the ideal product of UATX to be somebody who has a deep understanding of software and coding, as well as a very good grasp of mathematics and a good insight into multiple fields of STEM, but has also read Aristotle and Shakespeare. I firmly believe that Oppenheimer was a great, an important figure because he straddled the two cultures so brilliantly. And if you read American Prometheus, and I urge you to, it's better than just watching the movie, you realize what an incredible polymath he was. As at home with Sanskrit texts as with particle physics. So some people will be better at the Sanskrit and some will be better at the physics, but that's okay. I was not that good at physics, which my mother had studied and my sister does for a living, but I was respectful of it. And I've brought to my historical work a much higher proportion of scientific insight than the average humanities-trained historian. So I think this should be our great strength. And yeah, some people will grind their teeth at being locked in the cloister and forced to read Aristotle with no shortcuts. But it will be good for their brains. The most important thing that I learned in the last month, in the course of an argument with my 13-year-old son about whether he should or should not be given an iPhone, is that brain development is not really over till you're 25. Your brain is still pretty plastic and it is still being molded right through your undergraduate career. And so the shortcuts that ChatGPT offers are a disaster for your neural development. You will just be dumber. You will just be less smart if you are given an unfettered access to those tools. Whereas if you followed my injunction and spent a substantial part of your 4 years in the cloister without the tools, you will emerge smarter. And that is still my big pitch about UATX. You will crush the competition when you graduate from here. You will crush them in the interviews. You will crush them in the tests. You will be infinitely more attractive as an employee compared with the people who've come from the established institutions where none of these rigors, none of these constraints were imposed. So I think this is a really, really straightforward route that we can go down, where we insist on a combination of classical wisdom and modern science and technology, and insist that people learn to think and learn to do the math on the whiteboard, not delegating it to a large language model. I can't emphasize enough how much damage has already been done to your generation by these tools. In the space of 2.5 years, disastrous cognitive damage, worse than John hates smartphones and social media, worse than COVID and, useless Zoom classes. This is the worst thing to happen to the human brain, aside from very dangerous drugs, in my lifetime.
Last question. I want to pull out a little bit and think about perhaps some messages for UATX students and future UATX students. It seems to me that as a founding member of the UATX class, when you accept to go to UATX, you're kind of taking upon yourself a certain responsibility. It's a responsibility to yourself, to your fellow classmates, and to future classes to make the best UATX experience that you can. And it's a very particular responsibility that isn't present for students at other universities. I think that I speak for the student body when I say that this past year has been an amazing experience, and we would like to do more in order to help the university. And that it's been perhaps difficult at times to understand which avenues to go through to provide feedback, or what exactly the process that is. What would you say is, like, for a UATX student in the current class or incoming classes in the future, how do you operate? How do you make sure that UATX is the best school possible?
Well, I'm glad you asked that question. We have a new president. Carlos is here with us, and we're going to have a time over the summer for him and for everybody involved, including the trustees, to learn from year one. And I have no doubt that there will be a great effort to get feedback from all the students about every aspect of your experience. I think we'll be very, very busy processing the lessons of the past year. I'm having breakfast tomorrow with all the deans to get input from them so that I can go back to the trustees and say, well, now that we're coming to the end of the first year, this is what I'm hearing. I'll be talking to other key members of the leadership too. I think everybody involved knows that we have a ton to learn from this past year. We want to involve you, students, in making it work better, helping bring the second class on board. That's a hugely important thing. Helping close those deals. In a way, the first year was bound to attract a particular group of risk takers. And I think of the defining characteristic of the first class as being very high risk appetite. To commit your first degree to an entirely new institution, to be the very first students. You'll never be able, you'll never have to worry about that being replicated. You have the bragging rights. And the next class won't be able to match you for sheer risk appetite, because the next class is coming to an institution that's up and running and has had its first year. But I think building it into a sustainable institution so that we don't just have a 4-year cycle where we get you guys degrees and send you out into the world, but we start feeling that we've got a 30, 40, 50-year time horizon. That's a huge and exciting challenge. I can't think of a more worthwhile thing I've done, aside from having children, than this. Because, my career, going right back to when I was at school in Glasgow, was a series of long-established institutions. Glasgow Academy, where I studied, founded in the mid-19th century. Then I went to Oxford, with roots deep in the Middle Ages, to Magdalen College, a pre-Reformation institution. For years, I thought that universities had to be ancient, but that was part of what made them great. And then I did the same kind of thing coming to the United States. And it's taken me until quite late in my life to realize that these centuries-old institutions are sclerotic. They're almost certain not to cope with the shock of the future. And it was a great revelation to me, the realization 4 years ago, we need to create a new university because the old ones can't be fixed. And I believe that more now than I did 4 years ago. They're even less likely to be fixable under these new technological conditions. So we have to succeed. We've got to build the university of the future. Nobody else is doing it. We're uniquely building the university of the future. All the other universities, every single one, they're the universities of the past. Only the University of Austin is the university of the future. And our challenge is to be sufficiently visionary not to just build the university of the past. The default setting for a new institution, the easiest thing for it to do is to lapse into the old ways of doing things, because that's what everybody brings to it. Every professor we hired had already experience of the old universities. Only the undergraduates didn't. Only you guys had not been to the university of the past. So part of the challenge has been resisting the gravitational force of the old ways and making sure that we don't succumb to that temptation just to become another version of what we studied at and where we first taught. If we can keep true to that vision of the university of the future, then I think we will go from strength to strength. And yeah, eventually we will replace Harvard. It will simply look like an anachronistic thing to do to go there. And it will seem like the coolest thing to come here. So yeah, that's my reason for being here. That's why I jumped on a plane this morning, took the 10-hour flight, not in a private jet, because I really believe in what we're doing here, including this part of it, the part that the students run for themselves.
Professor Niall Ferguson, thank you very much.
Dylan, do we want to take some questions, or should we let...
Do we have time for them?
there seem to be questions.
10 minutes, all right.
Pass the microphone to whoever.
Okay.
Okay, great. Dylan, I'll let you do the selection.
Thank you so much for being here. One thing you didn't really talk about in your speech earlier was the allure of pre-professional opportunities. I think for many people who end up using AI or taking shortcuts, essentially, a big part of that is that they want more time to focus on the things that will actually get them jobs when they're out of the workforce, or that allow them to produce things now that they can put on their resumes. If you end up cloistering people off, how do you assure that the people who are taking that risk, that it actually does work out in the long term, and that they don't just end up as the, I don't know, much mocked PhD gender studies students of the 2010s?
When I talk to the top employers, Ken Griffin at Citadel or Steve Schwartzman at Blackstone, or their counterparts in the technology companies, the constant complaint is that the people they're hiring out of college are worse educated than was true 10 or 20 years ago. There's so much dissatisfaction with the quality of the Ivy League graduates that there's a kind of revolt against hiring them. So my sense is that you'll have to trust me on this, but when you graduate, you will be hugely in demand because of your superior intellectual firepower. What employers want is not people who've padded their resumes, trust me. What they want are people who can cope with vast quantities of information under high pressure, absorb it, analyze it, turn it into something actionable. That's what employers really need. And they also need people with good judgment, under uncertainty and under pressure. If we produce graduates that stand out for those qualities, and I believe we will, then very quickly, really starting 3 years from now, UATX will establish itself as an absolutely AAA rated brand in the quality of graduate, in the eyes of graduate recruiters. So that's my pitch. The thing that we're really working on here is the thing that counts for most.
Thank you.
Sir Robin, thank you again for being here, and we welcome you into our home. During the questioning period, you mentioned that we live in a political society, and indeed in our curriculum we've learned from Aristotle that politics is the architectonic science. But you also mentioned that you wouldn't get elected to the Oxford Union because you refused to lie. And so to that end, what advice do you have for students who are trying to get into politics without losing their soul?
Well, I'm the wrong person to ask that question. I do think public service is vitally important, and that those of my contemporaries who went into politics were not somehow morally inferior. On the contrary, it takes quite a sacrifice to go down that path. The pay is lousy by comparison with, say, the tech or financial sectors. But I think one has to, in order to prepare oneself for a political career, read deeply. One of the things that makes Winston Churchill stand out as a leader was his extraordinary historical depth. He'd really thought about and read about and wrote about politics. Whereas the kind of politician who goes straight into it from university and never does anything else, those people seem to me to be a big part of the problem. So here's my suggestion. Do not think of politics as a vocation in itself. In a democracy, the most impressive political leaders have had something else to them and have done something else besides politics. I'd almost say, don't do politics first. Do something else first, and then do politics if you have the talent for it, which I lacked. I thought about that for a time, and then I realized I just didn't have the necessary skills, which is a kind of regret. But one has to know one's limitations, as Clint Eastwood used to say.
Thank you.
So my question is kind of the opposite of Jacob's. I'm pro cloister, even just to get my attention span back. That sounds nice. But I just took a class called Work, Leisure, and the Good Life, and we read a bunch of really beautiful, moving texts defending leisure, not just for its human good, but as an act of learning. And I see that reflected in a lot of the like AI-based education initiatives that we see now. They sort of compress learning so that students either do like unstructured play, unstructured projects. Like in a way, there is more leisure. Like, is there a defense of leisure to be built into collegiate life? Like as you were saying, the statistics of more hours spent on that. And I guess what I'm asking is, if I'm in the cloister 8 hours a day, can I get like 2 hours in the ball pit or something?
If one thinks of the history of universities, and that takes you all the way back to Bologna in the 11th century or thereabouts, there always was a pretty clear allocation of time for what you call leisure. Not that anybody in medieval Italy would have known what you meant, but it wasn't all study and it wasn't all worship. When the universities began to take on their modern form in the 19th centuries, 19th and 20th centuries, each had its own peculiar form of leisure. That the American universities were big on football. One of the odder things about the early history of the University of Chicago was that its founder, whose name was Harper, although he was a tremendous scholar, insisted that there be a football team and obsessively attended its games. That's not a tradition that his successors kept up. In the German universities, which were the best universities in the world 100 years ago, before the downfall that was alluded to in the introduction, the German universities had this extraordinary culture of dueling. So they had these dueling societies instead of debating societies. The Burschenschaften and their ilk in the 19th century did this extraordinary business of fencing. I actually once went and met with the members of the dueling fraternities, which still existed in the 1980s. They all had these tremendous sword scars, and they demonstrated the kind of dueling that they did with sabers. Extraordinary business. So I don't think academic life works without leisure. And one of the interesting things about the University of Austin is that we've kind of left it to you. I don't expect you to take up dueling, and I can imagine it being quite problematic if you did. But I also don't think football is quite the thing. Rowing, of course, was the dominant non-academic activity at Oxford and Cambridge, and still is. And there is an appropriate waterway here. I think you're right in wanting that to be part of academic or university life. But it's wrong to think that AI can somehow save time on study and free up time for leisure. The thing about study is that it should be laborious. It's not supposed to be easy. When I was an undergraduate, I recklessly opted to take a paper on economic and social thought that had really been designed for people doing economics. And one of the texts was Keynes's general theory. I have never struggled more with a book than I struggled with that book. I read it from cover to cover 3 times, trying desperately to understand it. I can remember the physical pain of sitting, staring at that book, trying to understand what the marginal propensity to consume meant. If I'd had ChatGPT, I presumably could just have said to it, can you please summarize Keynes's general theory? And then I could have gone off and played cricket. But the fact that I had to figure it out laboriously, painstakingly, was important, very important. I think it was a decisive moment in my intellectual development that I got to grips with that book, even though it was really, really difficult. We used to have this phrase, my brain hurts. Do people still say that? It should hurt. It's supposed to hurt. It's supposed to be difficult. And I think we need to be a little bit more comfortable with difficulty. There isn't an LLM that will get you through enormously difficult physical challenges. You know, SEAL Team 6 can't simply say, hey, go swim in ice cold water for 6 hours. That's not a prompt. We have to take the same approach to intellectual development. It's got to hurt a bit, or our brains are simply not advancing. We're not building the neural pathways that we need to build if there isn't a little bit of a headache involved. Should I take one more question, or are we... There is one more, actually. I'll do a short answer. I think the guy whose apartment it is seems to me to have some claim.
Yeah. It is quite a pleasure. I did not expect to have a president, a founder, some deans here. It is quite wonderful. Throughout this talk, you've been speaking about the why behind UATX, and I think one of the big ones you mentioned was academic freedom, not only on behalf of the students, but on behalf of the faculty. And so with that being said, I would be curious to get your commentary on the grade quotas and the grading policy that UATX has implemented, because it doesn't seem very academically free to me for a faculty member to have to beg to their dean to issue A's beyond what was supposed to be in their class, and why that hasn't been publicized to current students.
There are moments when a trustee discovers the limits of his role. I and the other trustees have not directly involved ourselves in this question. Suffice to say that I'm very keen indeed we not go down the grade inflation route, because I think that has made the Ivy League institutions a laughing stock. How we do this is, I think, the kind of thing we're going to spend the summer thinking about. It's one of the items I fully expect to come up at breakfast tomorrow when I speak with the deans. I know that Tim has thoughts on this. I know that Carlos has thoughts on this. I think we can all, at this point, agree that it's a work in progress, and we need to come up with something that's uniquely ours. We certainly don't want to import the Harvard approach. But how we do this, I think, requires thought. I don't think it can be as simple as grading on a curve. I've worked with that system. I've seen the Harvard system. My own experiences at Oxford and Cambridge were of a more idiosyncratic system, where there was considerable discretion to examiners. But let me conclude with this thought. If we move, as I believe we should, to a system of examination only, no take-home assignments. If we move to an examination-only system, and we examine, as I believe we should, with a real separation of the teaching from the examining, I think we'll arrive at a fairer system because the dispersion will be greater in the quality of the work. What creates grade inflation is that everybody converges on a standard, increasingly, of course, with the help of large language models. When we've got you all sweating it out in under exam conditions, there'll be a greater range, and therefore marking will produce all kinds of final grades. Let me conclude with the plea for the alpha gamma mark. So at Oxford, it was possible to award all kinds of exotic marks using the Greek letter system. But the alpha gamma mark for a paper or an exam essay that was in places brilliant and in other places dreadful, I thought that was one of the better features of the system. I can remember coming across papers that were like that. Brilliant elements, dreadful elements. So maybe we end up with something a little bit closer to that, with more discretion, but greater dispersion. There have to be some C's out there. There just have to be. My son sat the Winchester entrance exam, the 13-year-old who was trying to get the iPhone. I was delighted that he got a C in history. It was just good to see that they gave out C's. Seems like a sign of a healthy institution that it gives out C's. So we have work to do on that subject. Let me conclude by thanking you for your hospitality in letting us hold the meeting here. It would all have been so much better if there had been gunfire and explosions audible from downtown. It's been as quiet as a Sunday in 19th century Edinburgh, so perhaps there wasn't a riot after all. But at any event, I want to express my thanks to everybody involved at the Austin Union, including our host, and to everybody who came along despite finals to be with me this evening. Thanks, everybody.